First, I would like to thank Laurel for her kind introduction and PJ Carefoot for the opportunity to give this lecture. Thank you as well to Mrs. Seltzer for endowing this lecture on an aspect of the book trade in memory of her husband and son. It is a pleasure to be here in the Fisher Library. I only wish we could all be gathered here in person. My research into nautical manuals and maritime book history started with a puzzle. This puzzle was actually a claim by a leading maritime historian, which caught my attention because I spent half a dozen years working for a rare bookseller in New York City. In his influential 1958 volume, The Art of Navigation in England in Elizabethan and early Stuart times, Commander D.W. Waters suggested that navigation books were produced for and by gentlemen. On this slide here, you see a Dutch depiction of a scholarly 16th century individual in his 40s with quite an impressive collection of maritime paraphernalia, an armillary sphere, mathematical compass, his trusty dog, and certainly a good number of books. However, Waters' claim just didn't ring true to me. If the nautical authors in the 16th century were writing for elite, educated gentlemen in their studies, like this man, men who actually didn't go to sea, why were there so many of these books? Between the 16th and 18th centuries, we find not just dozens, but hundreds of manuals about the art or science of navigation, published in most of the vernacular languages of Europe. Just how many of these books there were is a non-trivial question. In the course of my research, I spent quite a lot of time reading navigational textbooks so that you don't have to. I also did my best to count them, something which had not yet been done. My best estimate is that there were 600 distinct titles, give or take, published over the course of the 16th through 18th centuries in at least 8 languages. Some of these saw more than 20 editions, and the Fisher holds a good number of them. I'm happy to discuss this further in the Q&A, but just think for a moment. Hundreds of authors felt it was worth their while to tackle the complex but crucial topic of how to safely cross the sea. From a book trade perspective, the economics of Waters' argument just don't make sense. There weren't that many gentlemen interested in math and science. So these manuals must have been, at least in part, addressed to practitioners. That could explain why so many authors wrote these books and so many publishers invested in them. So the bookseller in me believed this to be true, but how could the historian in me prove it? I set out to find evidence of literate mariners. Now, it's not easy to find signs of anonymous working men. They rarely show up in the records. But in fact, I was able to uncover a significant number of them in archives in half a dozen countries. I've published these results in my book, Sailing School, Navigating Science and Skill, 1550 to 1800, which is a comparative study of nautical training. This work aims to bring together maritime history, the history of science, and book history. It turns out that there was a major shift between the 16th and 18th centuries, and this happened because navigators began to learn from books instead of apprenticeships at sea. The manuals that Waters dismissed as being only accessible for gentlemen were actually key tools for working sailors. Printed books codified the concepts and rules of navigation and made these easier to share with mariners in different nations. So the intriguing story here is about the increasing popularity of print in these unexpected quarters. In the early 16th century, navigators did not have to be literate. It was entirely possible to spend years as a mariner relying only on your memory. However, as European fleets began sailing across the oceans instead of hugging the coasts, they needed new methods of wayfinding. These were more complex and abstract and far more mathematical. And it was this shift that sent more and more sailors into the classroom. New generations of mariners often needed assistance learning the technical details and especially the mathematical formulas of celestial navigation. At this point, in the 17th century, educational navigation materials saw a boom. So today, I'd like to share with you some of the evidence I found of the different phases of maritime print culture, How did authors, publishers, and booksellers go about convincing mariners to trust books? How did they create and expand their market? Who were the experts who contributed content? Let us spend some time with the merchants and mariners in this maritime book history. In my time this evening, I'm going to focus on 3 pairs of books published in 3 different countries. We're going to visit Spain, the Netherlands, and England to highlight how their authors and publishers worked to develop the readership in different times and places. These strategies will give us a sense of how bookselling evolved in various port cities. I think we see echoes of a fair number of these strategies in the present day, giving us insights into how the maritime book grew into a genre with considerable popularity, turning nautical bookshops into institutions along many waterside communities. The earliest people to print navigation manuals were the Iberians. We don't have many extant examples of early Portuguese texts, but those produced by Spanish authors proved to be very influential across Europe and beyond. So here you see 2 of the most popular texts by Pedro de Medina and Martin Cortés. These men wrote their textbooks to help teach pilotos, navigators, at the new school founded at the Casa de la Contratación, the House of Trade in Seville. I'm happy to speak at greater length about this Spanish model of nautical education, but briefly, it was set up to imitate universities. There were professors of cosmography, which is like geography, but the science of the heavens rather than the earth. These professors set out to teach the men in their classrooms the same way that they had learned, not in Latin, but in seats with textbooks, lecture notes, and exams. You might note that this is a pretty strange approach for the barely literate sailors that the Spanish crown was recruiting to traverse the globe. But yes, lecture notes, exam questions, and to make everything easy, textbooks. What's interesting is that the student pilotos probably initially started out with the same textbooks that university students would have used to learn cosmography, classics like Sacrobosco and Appianus. These are called the sphere books, the science of the sphere. And there were many, many editions in Latin, but also in vernacular languages. And these sphere books were very successful in part because they conveyed a lot of complex information about the shape and guiding organization of the universe in engaging woodcut illustrations. However, the texts themselves were still pretty dense and technical, suitable probably for university men, rather less so for mariners. So that is when the cosmographers at the Casa began to write their own textbooks. So Cortés was a humanist with little personal navigational experience, but Pedro de Medina did serve the crown as a consultant on matters maritime, and he wrote his book to try and get a teaching post at the school at the Casa. As I mentioned, these 2 books were extremely popular. They carried the Spanish model of navigation north to other corners of Europe. You can see the English loved Cortés with 7 different editions, while Medina's work was translated into 4 languages. The French alone published 15 different editions. There were also Dutch, English, and Italian. I want to show you a few differences between the early university cosmographical texts and these new ones. Medina and Cortés knew that the Spanish crown viewed navigation as a valuable science, one with considerable importance for their empire. So that's why Cortés's 1551 brief compendium of the sphere depicts on its title page the imperial coat of arms with the eagle, in between the 2 famed columns of Hercules, the symbol that the Spanish Empire had passed beyond the bounds of the Mediterranean at Gibraltar and were pushing across the Atlantic into the unknown. Cortés dedicated the volume to King Charles V. De Medina, in his slightly earlier work, which was 1545, also had the royal arms on the title page. You might be able to tell from these lavish title pages that no expense was spared on these books. Both of the printers splurged to print in black and red ink, and they are very extensively illustrated. Here in Medina, each chapter has a full-page woodcut, which is quite unusual for the period. Also, these books are large. Here is the Medina next to one of the earlier sphere textbooks. So you can see the Medina at 34 centimeters is either a small folio or a large quarto. The Appianus is a tiny, probably octavo. The sphere itself was not a very long text, under 100 pages, so it was typically printed in this modern, modest pocket size. You could tie your covers together and slip it into your bag. By contrast, both Medina and Cortez were these taller folio formats. And I'll just show you a French translation from 1569. Once again, very elegant spacing, wide margins, lots of white space. The French removed the Spanish imperial imagery, but you still have this very elegant title page. So these are all signs that the publishers were producing luxury volumes. I'd like to suggest that these first specialized works devoted to the science of navigation look different from the run-of-the-mill cosmographies that they were based on because navigation was so important, the big science of its day. The state was interested in increasing the number of skilled mariners, expanding the trainees in the pipeline, and pouring on funding to solve technical challenges like the longitude problem. The Spanish ran a contest, just like the English would do 150 years later. So, because these books were the first of their kind, the early 16th century authors and their publishers weren't quite sure how to treat them. They were too technical to be truly lavish showstoppers, like another work of Appianus, the Astronomica Caesarium, which was dedicated to the emperor. This Metropolitan Museum copy is 45 centimeters tall, so 50% again larger than the Medina, and had dozens of hand-colored rotating volvelles. Truly one of the most impressive works of printing. So we're not dealing with that. This is really more technical. And so at this early period, people were not sure. Would anyone who didn't have to actually want to read definitions of the pole or the equinox? Would they want to read chapters about the winds and the tides? So because there were no clear audience yet, Medina and Cortez aimed at anyone they could think of who might be interested and who might pay for these books. By making them attractive, high-end, and illustrated, they signaled the value of the information contained within. So now we're going to move north, as these impressive Iberian manuals also did, from Spain to Amsterdam. Here you can see the first Dutch translation of Medina, actually made in Antwerp in 1581, and followed by a French translation within the same year. A separate text by Michiel Coignet was appended at the back, and that focused not on cosmographical definitions, but on some of the new instruments useful on the open water. So this Medina Coignet is considerably smaller than the Spanish original, so no longer as lavish and dedicated to the king. This is just a regular quarto. This one measures 21 centimeters tall. No sooner had this publication appeared in Antwerp did it see a reprint in Amsterdam. In 1589, it was put into print by one of the most successful booksellers of the century, Cornelis Claes, or Claesen. So you can see his address here at the bottom, printed in Amsterdam by Cornelis Claes on the water in the writing book by the old bridge. A side note, Claes made the decision to reprint the Medina 3 times in total, so 1589, 1593, and 1598. This is interesting because if you remember the Spanish Armada, Philip II's armada was embarrassingly trounced off the Scottish coast in 1588, but it was still worth it. The valuable Spanish navigation information was still important enough for the Dutch to want to have their own copies of it. So this suggests that the earlier editions were also selling out. So we know that Claes's store was on the water by the old bridge at the sign of the writing book, het schrijfboek, and this is at the Damrak. So I'm estimating that it was around the bridge where the red star is in the slide. And unfortunately, we don't know too much about Claes's physical bookshop. It was likely his family home, so his living quarters would have been upstairs. There would have been several printing presses in the back, and a substantial retail operation in the front, facing the oldest part of Amsterdam's harbor. Over the course of nearly 3 decades, between 1582 and 1609, Cornelis Claes became the most important bookseller in the Netherlands. He started as a general interest publisher, printing Bibles and translations of Calvin's commentaries, political tracts on the war against Spain, medical and legal textbooks, maps, and popular literature. In the 1590s, however, he narrowed his focus to nautical imprints. Unlike certain famous sort of intellectual master printers like Plantin, who edited Latin humanist works, Cornelis Claes simply had an eye for what would sell. Visitors to his establishment in the late 1590s could find something to suit any budget, career trajectory, and appetite for detail, from a pocket-sized set of astronomical tables, or a Dutch language edition of an intriguing foreign text, or an elegant atlas. I want to give you a glimpse into a bookshop, and so here we have 2 images sketched by Salomon de Bray, or perhaps his son Dirk, around the 1650s. They were drawn half a century after Claes's heyday, and probably in Haarlem rather than in Amsterdam, but I think they give us a sense of what it would be like to go shopping for books in the Netherlands. Here we see customers rubbing elbows in a well-stocked bookshop. In the right-hand image, you can see possibly a father shopping with his son, since he's rather short stature. You can tell by the clothes that these men are well off, and you can tell that the shop itself is doing very well financially. Look at these full shelves. Admire the framed art on the wall. Here's a close-up. It's hard to tell if all the books here on the shelves are already bound, something that would have been unusual. Typically, you would go to the bookstore or the publisher's storefront and simply decide how much you wanted to spend on your binding once you had purchased the unbound sheets of your new book. Did you want a simple, flexible vellum binding? Would you choose sturdier and more expensive calf? Did you want it decorated with gold or embossed, hand-colored? Each of these choices would increase the price of the volume. Here's the other image. Not only could you evidently bring your dogs into the shop with you, but you could probably also buy pens, ink, reams of paper, and blank notebooks, those writing books for which Cornelis Claes named his business. Of extra interest to me here are, up on the very top shelf, the globes, cross-staff, and rolled charts. So this shop, like Claes's, catered to maritime men. Men who came to purchase maritime volumes would also exchange tidbits of news, learn about new instruments, and forge connections with the wider community. In the 1580s, the Netherlands was newly independent from Spain after the Dutch revolt. Their maritime industry was still largely based on short-distance coastal ventures where they served as middlemen carrying trade goods for other nations. They would first venture to Asia in 1595, so their dominance in the spice and other trade would lie ahead, as would its main period of Arctic whaling. At this point, or at every point in history, a large percentage of the Dutch workforce earned their livelihood from the water. And so at this time, They were trading herring, wool, wine, and lumber. Many young boys went to sea with family members and spent years doing hands-on apprenticeships, something that worked out very well, as I mentioned, for repeated trips along the coast. But, as we know, the Spanish and Portuguese had just spent much of the 16th century making long-distance open water voyages, navigating by the sun and the stars, and the Dutch wanted to learn how to do the same. So, Claes saw an opportunity and leapt in. He made a strategic decision to offer a robust list of variously priced navigational works, a move that ensured that readership in this already substantially nautically minded city would expand beyond just this jostling harbor. Not only does Claes publish the Medina Coignet edition 3 times, and then an Appianus, originally from Antwerp, appeared twice, he sought out other books that would sell to this maritime readership. One of the most important books for mariners were tables. So he offers 2 different ones in the old or new style, depending on whether you had adopted the calendrical reforms of the 1580s. And you can see, again, sizable woodcuts, 2-color printing, but these are slim pamphlets, only 14 or 20 leaves. From internal evidence, we suggest, or we're quite certain, that there would have been numerous editions, a new one each year probably, but each of these tables survives in just a single copy. Claes probably produced hundreds, if not thousands, of these almanacs, but they saw hard use. Tables are exactly the kind of ephemera that would be lucrative for printers because they could keep their presses busy in between larger, more specialized projects. But the tables disappear from the record because they were used so much. Every mariner needed tables like these to keep in their pocket to consult the time of the tides, the position of the sun, any noteworthy astronomical events. The longest you could use a set of tables would be 4 years, basically from leap year to leap year. And after that, the positions of the celestial bodies had shifted too much for them to give you accurate times for your tides. So when you look into these almanacs, this is a contemporary one published a little further north in Franeker. These are dense columns of numbers. They're technical, and they really prove that mariners need to be comfortable with numbers. So to become more numerate, sailors found themselves seeking out lessons in various small schools which popped up in port cities. So now I'd like to spend a few minutes on another dramatically different work, also published by Claes. This is Lucas Jansson Vachenar's Spiegel der Seefahrt, so the Mirror of Navigation. This is one of the earliest nautical atlases, and it was so important that in England they began to refer to all nautical atlases as wagoners after Vachenar. So this is the original, as I said, published in Leiden by Plantin in 1584. Claes, in his typical fashion, liked to print a slightly cheaper knockoff of the Spiegel. This is a German translation. The modern facsimile has kind of lurid colors. So this is the 1589 German Amsterdam edition of Vachenar. And he was able to do this because Vachenar was actually in the process of preparing a brand new, even fancier atlas, which was called the Trésor der Seefahrt, which Plantin would also print in Leiden. So what does Claes do? He buys the engraved copper plates from Plantin and went to work. He translated it and reissued the same plates. And in fact, in order to make this affordable for his purchasers, you could actually buy separate sections of the atlas. We have surviving evidence of how much you could pay for part 1 if you didn't want part 2. if you're only interested in certain regions of the world and wanted to save some money. So Vachenar himself was an interesting and important character. He had been to sea himself and then embarked on this not always lucrative cartographic career. He seems to really have loved astronomy. He advertised himself as a great navigation teacher because he had memorized all the stars in the sky. Possible at that time because people really were only identifying about 200 constellations. So if you studied with Vachenar, he would promise to teach you every star in the sky. So he had an idea to produce the innovative kind of atlas, which had these very detailed engraved charts showing the depth of different coastal areas, other kind of hazards. A lot of important navigational information is converted into visual form. But he faced an uphill battle. Sailors didn't see why they needed anything so newfangled. Previously, they had been using rutters, routier, where you would have textual, verbal description of how to sail from point A to point B. And people didn't know how to use these. So other sailors were skeptical of books in general. They were still not all that literate, and they preferred the methods that they'd been relying on for generations. They would rather use their memory, and if necessary, quick little sketches of key portions of the shoreline. Here you can see the kind of coastal profiles that really were dominant in the early 16th century. This is actually the second atlas that Vachenar produced. He put them back in because there had been such a hue and cry that the Spiegel didn't include the coastal profiles. The Trésor has them again. So it's interesting to see, even as we have innovation, we also have the maintenance of certain traditional elements. Vachenar was rightly convinced that nautical charts were the way of the future, but he wanted to help his main customers, those working mariners who still really wanted to see these depictions of mountains and headlands. It turns out, of course, that sailors in the 16th century were right to be cautious about print. A lot of manuals were written by people like Cortez, who had no practical experience at sea. There was a lot of theory in some of these books and not enough practical, useful information. And there could be errors. Vachenar's famous successor, William Janssen Blau, who also made his name as an atlas publisher, he noted that published charts could have very dangerous errors because they could be reprinted and have devastating ripple effects. What's interesting again about Vachenar is that he had a deep respect for experienced captains, pilots, navigators, and others. Here I just have a sketch of some working mariners. It's not all that common to find images where they don't all look drunk. People tried to, caricature these sailors, and certainly there were some, but there were also more scenes like this of informal gatherings on piers of these hardworking sailors. So Vachenar actually went directly to the experts and asked. He said, if you have noted anything new in your travels, please report this to me. If you have a problem, if you find an error in one of my charts, please report it. And he actually puts a little note in the preface of the German Spiegel to say, if you find anything, pass any tips on to me or to class, and we will pay you more than double. So this is a strategy of using the expertise of his audience to make his new books even more trustworthy. So Vachenar tells us that he intended his handsome folio atlas for mariners, masters, which are captains, and merchants. So this is the title of my talk today. I want to really show that there are books about navigation that have this multiple audience. So mariners, masters, and merchants. And in these volumes, Vachenar was offering advice to apprentices, to young sailors who were just setting out. He solicited feedback from old, capable navigators, and he was holding up a mirror to illuminate this fascinating and vital subject for merchants and other curious readers on shore. From his introduction, we can really tell that Vachenar did intend his atlases to be working tools. As I mentioned, they were graphical rather than textual instructions for navigating the eastern and western oceans, he called them. However, he really did also want to curry favor with the merchant audience. Here's one of my favorite images. It's a little hard to make out, but I hope you can see. Here's a zoom in. A group of, again, well-dressed men gathered around a table with rolled out charts, probably a magnetic compass and mathematical compasses. The floor is strewn with more instruments, armillary sphere, oversized quadrants. Over in this small oblong book there is an atlas. So this is a room of maritime men filled with their tools, but from their clothing and their hats and their collars, they are more likely to be merchants, the men who were preparing for these long-distance spice voyages, rather than necessarily the men who were themselves going to sea. So I think this is who Vachenar had in mind when he said, I've got an expensive, beautiful book which has all the latest information in it, and you guys should buy it. So it's kind of funny because in this book there's a mixture of information. Vachenar includes digressions on trade, which would not have been that interesting for the sailors, but he also explained topics that would have already been pretty familiar to sailors. So those are hints that merchants were one of the audiences. Whatever Vachenar thought about the utility of his new charts, he recognized they were expensive. There was a lot of copper, and those, that engraving was costly. So he needed a large number of people to purchase his atlases. So we see that in the Netherlands, like in Spain with Medina and Cortez, people with money would buy navigational works, and this is why so many of these technical volumes have quite basic introductory material at the beginning, and they have concrete technical information, introductions to new instruments, but also explanations of classic ones. Again, we're in the late 16th century, which is still the early phase of building that nautical market that I talked about. No one, not Vachenar, not Claes, was really sure that they would continue to sell these works. Maybe people would be done after they purchased one. But these pioneers really demonstrated that there was indeed a desire and an audience for this material. Both the professional mariners and the interested landlubbers. The books often address the second category as liefhebber. The Dutch means having love, haver, which is basically the French amateur. So someone who loves the subject. Other authors and publishers quickly jumped on the bandwagon in other Dutch cities and soon across the Channel. So we'll move from my third example now to England. And some of you may be familiar with the English book market, which is markedly different from the decentralized Dutch situation. In the Netherlands, every city and port, from Delft to Rotterdam to Hoorn, they all had publishers. In England, there was really a monopoly on print in London. There was the considerable power of the Stationers' Company, and again, really the publishers were based in the capital. So that meant competition was fierce and seems to have led to a number of publishers or booksellers to specialize quite early. We'll find presses that made their living from religious titles, others from legal works, and a few from mathematical, scientific, and technical works. One of the most famous publishing firms with connections to maritime communities is called Mount and Page. They're particularly associated with maps, but in fact, they were early specialists in navigational titles. So it's interesting, it's hard to find images of publishers. So I have a blank screen here as I introduce Mount and Page. Richard Mount, in the 1690s, took over his father-in-law's business after he had apprenticed with him. And that firm had taken over a struggling chart-making business by John Seltzer. So quite famous at his heyday, but also not financially solvent, a little bit like Vachenar. Maps were expensive to produce. So because of this connection to Seltzer and his charts and probably engraved plates, Mount set on a path focused on sea atlases. Then in 1701, he joined forces with his son-in-law and former apprentice, Thomas Page. And so this is the sort of evolution of the Mount and Page firm. The Mount family ran the firm for 4 generations until the 1780s. So someone other than me is welcome to give a lecture on the cartographic publishing of Mount and Page, but I would like to spend a few minutes looking at how they marketed their materials and particularly their books. We have a record in the papers of the famous diarist Samuel Peeps, who was also Secretary of the Admiralty and responsible for a fair number of interesting reforms during the 1680s and 90s. So Peeps really was interested in books and keeps this record in his library, which still survives in Cambridge. And we find a list that Richard Mount prepared for Peeps of all books of practical navigation hitherto printed in England. And there's dates, editions, and prices. This is from December 1694. So this is probably Pepys's secretary's hand, and he notes that Mount is master of the ancient shop, meaning the old business, and our only magazine, right? So again, the French word for store, of English books of navigation. Mount put together page after page of titles. And then here in the center, if you can make out, all of these titles were by John Seltzer. So again, Mount was very familiar with the stock that was published by his predecessor. But again, this was a substantial number of books already by the 1690s in England about navigation. Pepys also wrote to a contact in the Netherlands to get more lists of Dutch titles. He was really concerned that his nation's rivals knew more about navigation than the English did. And he saw books as the first step to correcting this dearth of knowledge. So here we are, 1690s, a century after Claes and Vachenar were working to build up enough clientele to support their nautical book business. And there were many, many titles in England. We see more evidence of this because Mount and Page helpfully provide advertisements in a number of the books that they published. So it's a little, again, tricky to make out, but this list of books of navigation printed for William Mount and Thomas Page on Tower Hill comes from a later edition, 1736. But you can see at the top a list of atlases. The important Mount and Page books were the Coasting Pilot and the English Pilot. And then there are a section of charts. And I wanted to just highlight here a series of introductory manuals. Again, happy to take questions about these, but really the kind of basics of what do you do, kind of the updated cosmography of the 17th century. The Seaman's Practice, the Seaman's Companion, the Seaman's Calendar, the Seaman's New Calendar, and Practical Navigation or an Introduction to the Whole Art of navigation. So those are just some possibilities that you could purchase if you went to Mountain Page. There are also a section on mathematics, useful for or essential for mariners, logarithms, algebra, general mathematics, and then books on rigging and shipwrightry. He's got you covered. There's a second page here, which again has the same sort of, I don't know, it kind of flips between cartographic, mathematical, and technical books. At the very bottom, you can see a reminder that Mountain Page also provides, in addition to all sorts of mathematical and sea books, pilots, sea charts for all parts of the known world, plain or Mercator, so those are the different options for your maps. They sell paper books, the best ink, and all other stationery ware. So while they have a reputation as cartographic publishers, this advertisement demonstrates a far more all-purpose institution. These books could turn any green young man into a knowledgeable sailor. We've got another similar ad also in a Mountain Page publication. This is from 1714. And I like how it's right at the beginning of the book in the prefatory material, designed to catch the attention of all lovers and learners of navigation. So again, this lover, the liefhebber, the amateur, might refer to the merchants or those practitioners who just were keen and devoted to the subject. Lest we think that Mountain Page were unusual, I have another example of what Joseph Mockson offered for sale in 1696. Book historians remember Mockson for his important early depiction of the printing process, but in fact, he specialized in mathematical books and instruments. He was the hydrographer to King Charles II. In his youth, Mockson visited Amsterdam and apprenticed with the famous globe and atlas maker, who I've mentioned before, Willem Janssen Blauw. So when Mockson went back to England, he began printing and selling large celestial and terrestrial globes. He even published an English translation of a treatise that Blauw produced, a guide to globes, a handbook basically designed as a sales tool for the rather expensive globes. If you read this book and it sounds intriguing, all of a sudden you found yourself with these, huge technical globes that you've decided to shell out a lot of money for. So this Mockson advertisement starts with instruments, so globes at the top, and then some other instruments, Gunter's quadrant, map of the world, and then a page and a half of books. So like Mountain Page, you can see that you can have all manners, here at the bottom, all manner of maps, sea plats, drafts, so both of those are charts, mathematical books, instruments, etc., at the lowest prices. And it continues. Here's another Mockson title, which he printed, Edward Wright's Certain Errors in Navigation, 1657. And so this list of instruments at the top, globes, spheres, are all for the use of mariners. So again, he's our globe guy, so he puts those at the top. Globes celestial and terrestrial of all sizes, and books for the use of them. And you'll see he is going to offer a handbook for anything he sells. So if you have a sphere, like an armillary sphere, books for the use of them. Down at the bottom, more mathematical instruments, also books for the use of every of the foresaid instruments. And then in the middle, I want to call your attention to this fact. He says, these diverse mathematical instruments are printed on paper and exactly pasted on board. And this is kind of one of these other strategies for making money as a technical bookseller or producer of all things navigational. And this is actually useful both for customers and for the publishers, because people like to sell the engravings, which were in the books, as separate broadsides. You'd already sunk the money into having the expensive copper plate made, so you may as well print some separate sheets and sell those. This one comes from the Vachenar Atlas. It's a spinning volvel which can help you calculate the time. As you see, the Little Dipper will spin around the North Pole, and that will tell you the time. So if you can't carry the huge atlas around with you, you could buy the sort of large sheet and use that as a working tool. I have a couple more images of instruments. Here, this is a French, it's called a Cartier de Reduxion, which is sort of a visual way of figuring out your position. And I love this one because you can see the ink and the calculations in the top that someone really did use this. It's pasted on cardboard and almost worn out. So again, this sort of paper ephemera was sort of value added, but one of the other reasons that you would go to your nautical bookshop. This one, a little bit of a low-res image, but really notable because, again, it's another French sort of visual way of determining position, but actually printed not on paper, but on vellum. So you could use that when you're on your boat. And if the spray gets you wet, fear not, because paper would kind of deteriorate, but the vellum is tough and waterproof. So again, these publishers and authors are always thinking of how to make aspects of their book really useful for practitioners. And I have just worked on a chapter which is basically talks about the sort of two-dimensional and three-dimensional instruments, and when are images in these textbooks just explanations, and when are they actually functional instruments in their own right. So really, we just see booksellers hustling, not wasting any opportunity to try and cement their profits. A lot of these strategies in the late 18th century are familiar from the 16th century, and because the Mountain Page firm was so long-lasting, I'm going to use them to sort of slide to the end of the 18th century. Remember when Vachenar worked to build credibility for his atlases by soliciting contributions from working sailors? Mountain Page do the same thing. This is, I think, from the, sorry, I don't have the date, but the 1780s. By this point, they're now Mount and Davidson. And they did the same thing. So here in this late edition of their best-selling atlas, The English Pilot, they note in the middle here, the whole being much enlarged and corrected with the additions of several new charts and descriptions by the information of diverse able navigators of our own and other nations. So again, trust us because we have insider input. So let's circle back to the beginning to see if we have solved the puzzle that caught my attention. It certainly might be true, given the levels of literacy in the early 16th century, that some of those first books were aimed at gentlemen. And certainly even moving forward, they continue to be a key part of the audience. In the Netherlands, we find appendices of these basic introductory navigation textbooks that have very advanced math problems. I don't think those were necessarily appreciated by all the practicing sailors. That's where we can tell that the Liefhebber were still buying these navigation books. However, by the 18th century, the books had, I almost want to say, devolved. They had at least been simplified down to an audience of primarily students. So here is one from 1801, an English work dedicated. It's called The Young Midshipmen's Instructor. What's interesting is that the subtitle includes hints to parents of sea youth. So in some ways, you're not sure whether the parents are buying this. There's also sort of the idea that you could teach yourself with my book. You don't need to pay for lessons. So David Morris was kind of an educational entrepreneur. But when we look at this, gone are the beautiful large margins, gone are the attractive engraved title pages, or the flowery dedicatory poems, or even the helpful images. Instead, we have dozens of pages of practice questions. You might say, well, isn't that just the difference between 17th century and 18th century publishing? Everyone was shifting to more economical print. But I actually think that this is a sign that the market for navigation books had gotten large enough to splinter into different specialties. So whereas once you were addressing the merchants and the mariners and the masters, now there are certain people who are going to purchase, for instance, travel narratives, like the 3-volume account of Cook's circumnavigation. And there would be a different set of people who would buy technical or legal treatises. And none of those were the same as the students who needed to teach themselves enough math to pass their exams. So I wanted to be able to conclude this talk with pictures of another bookshop from the 18th century, similar to when we looked in on the crowded shelf of Classes Contemporary in Haarlem. However, it was a little more difficult than I expected. There are a few images that survive, and more images tend to be of lending libraries. The first one that caught my eye here, it's called Wallace's Library Shed, but it's actually known as Wallace's Marine Library. So I got really excited. I thought, amazing, here is a maritime library. No, it actually means it's by the seashore. If you went on a beach vacation in Devon and needed something to read, you could go to the Marine Library, sit on their veranda, and read the latest novels. So, alas, not technical. This is a bookstore famous, actually, because it was enormous. James Lackington founded this around 1794 and called it the Temple of the Muses. And so you can see up in the top, huge ladders to access the fabulous stock. You could go up into the cupola and read more books up there. I like this because there are women buying books. So this has really evidence of the scale of bookselling in London at the very end of the 18th century, but probably unlikely, again, to have sailors walking in to the Temple of the Muses. The best example that I could come up with is another one from 1803, and I like this one. It's called the Eccentric Book Warehouse, and it's the shop front of Tegg and Castleman Publishers. This one is really almost not, it wouldn't be out of place today, right? We can see, again, parents probably shopping with their children, women in the picture again, and no dogs in this picture, but in a contemporary one, again, people are bringing their dogs book shopping. I can't really promise that this particularly eccentric warehouse would have held navigation textbooks. It seems that Tegg actually specialized in lurid Gothic tales, but I do think the principles are similar. In order to survive in the book trade, particularly in its specialized corners, authors, publishers, and booksellers needed to cast a wide net to publish a mixture of high-end and practical, some affordable texts, but give people the option to invest in extras. The shop owner, the publisher, would hope that people would come to buy a textbook and then leave with one of the new instruments that would be essential to his future career, or someone who thought that he or she just needed paper and ink might take home several of the latest intriguing titles. I think in this tour of the development of the maritime book market, we can see some of the tips and techniques that have led to the establishment of maritime literature, which I think is here to stay. Thank you very much.